In this video, I'm going to talk about Ansible roles and how you can create them and how they work and why they are useful. So basically, what you've seen so far is that you can create playbooks that contain plays, and these plays have tasks, and you can create files that actually contain tasks that allow you to run a specific set of operations that allow you to run your provisioning. Very often, these tasks are related to variables, as we have seen in the previous week, and it's very useful for us to be able to manage tasks and variables and everything that relates to provisioning at the same time in a sort of a logical unit. And that's what Ansible roles are for. They are like a collection of variables, tasks, etc., that are set up in a known file structure that makes it easy to use, reuse, and share these elements in your team or across a group of system administrators, for instance. So that's what Ansible roles are. There is a very good documentation on the Ansible website that allows you to understand a little bit better how roles work. So if you think about infrastructure as code, you have, as I said, the Ansible modules. They will be a bit like your functions. So you would use these modules to run a specific task, and it would return something back to you, and it can take parameters, etc., like a function in programming does. And then if your Ansible modules are your functions, then your Ansible roles are going to be your classes, kind of things. So it will allow you to put together attributes, variables, methods, functions, Ansible modules in a coherent and consistent way so that you can use it in your project. So the first thing that you need to do when you're working with roles is, well, first of all, you can reuse a role that already exists on the internet, but what we're going to do is create our own. And Ansible comes with a set of tools that allows you to create your own roles. And these tools, well, one of them is called Ansible Galaxy. And it's a tool that, well, allows you to manage all kind of Ansible dependencies, modules, etc. And one of them allows you to create a role by using Ansible Galaxy role. Actually, this command takes a couple of arguments as well. And the first argument that we need to create is to initialize a new role. So we can do Ansible role init, and actually we'll need also the name of the role. So let's say, for the example, I'm going to create a role called video. And now my role video was created successfully. So if you look at your folder structure, I didn't have anything here. I just set up my private key and my keys and my inventory. But now I have this video folder that was created for me. And if I look inside this video folder, you will see that a bunch of folders were created. And some of these folders, we actually recognize them. So files, for instance, relates to everything that is a file in your Ansible playbook. In the meta, we can define new tasks like refresh inventory. Task is going to be the main area where you're going to work in your role. It will contain all your tasks file for this role. Templates is a bit like files, but for templates. And then you have vars, which is pretty important, that works together with defaults. And then tests if you wanted to create tests for your role. So as soon as you create a role using Ansible Galaxy, it creates all these folders that you can then use to create your wanted behavior for your role. Now, if you look at these folders, you will see that each of them has a main .yaml file in it, except the templates folder, which is supposed to hold files. But the vars folder will also have a main.yaml, and the defaults folder will also have a main.yaml. So this is this main.yaml is the main entry point for your role. And basically, what's going to happen is that when you're going to use your role, it will load all these folders at the same time to create an environment that is predictable that you can use. So everything in the vars and defaults will be loaded as variables, and then the tasks from the main.yaml will be run. You can create other files as well, and we'll see that a little bit later. But by default, main.yaml is the main entry point for your folders in your role. So now what I'm going to do is create a playbook that will use this role that doesn't do anything yet. So this playbook will run on my service app, and it's not going to do much. It's just going to import role. Sorry. Import role video. Okay, so I created a EC2 instance earlier. So I actually have one in my inventory, which is just been provisioned completely empty. It has a public IP address, and it's in my service app group. So if I've done everything right, let me double check that this machine can be accessed. Okay, so now I can run my playbook. Oops. Name. What did name the electronic bit? Oh, yeah. That was the wrong syntax. I confused it with using role as a keyword. So the preferred way of using roles is to use import or include, and the same limitations apply to import and include for roles as they used to be for tasks. So if you use import role and you use a tag, then all the tasks in the role that you're going to import are going to be tagged with that tag. So you just need to be careful about that. So here you can see that my playbook has run, and it actually didn't do anything because my role doesn't have any tasks in it. So if I look at my main.yaml in my tasks, you can see that this file is completely empty. So I'm going to add a task here, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Maybe just apt. Let's install Nginx, for instance, and do that as root. So now if I run my playbook again, because it uses a role that now has a task in it, you can see that the apt task from my role is being run. And this apt task is in the main.yaml in the tasks file of my role. So this is basically how roles work. You create your tasks file. All the default actions are going to go in the main.yaml, and you can create other files additional to the main.yaml. So for instance, I have main here. I'm just going to create example.yaml, and this is going to, well, it's just going to print a message on the screen. Let's say that I am the example.yaml file. So now in my main playbook, I can import my role video, but I can import my example.yaml tasks. So I can do import role, I will import from the same role. And here I will use tasks from, and I'm going to use example.yaml. So what this is going to do is that it will load the role video, but instead of running the main.yaml, it will run example.yaml. So let's see what that does. Okay, so we can see that the second task here actually comes from the second task file that was called in the main playbook. That's one way you can use roles as a nice placeholder to separate the logic between your different tasks file. They will all be located in the tasks folder of your role, and in your main playbook, you can decide to import whichever task file you want from that role. Another thing that you can do with roles is set up variables, and these variables are going to be automatically loaded into your Ansible environment when the role is going to be imported. So if we look at, and there are two folders for the variables, and we are going to go a little bit more in depth about them soon. You have defaults and you have vars. So you can consider that defaults, they are like your default values for your parameters, and vars, they are more like private variables because they have a very high precedence in the Ansible hierarchy. So we are going to use defaults to set up our variables, and in my defaults in my main.yaml, I'm going to use a variable here, and my variable is going to be name, and here I'm going to use my own name as a variable. So now what that means is that every time I'm going to import that role video, this main.yaml is going to be run, and it will run, it will load variables from this file. So my name will be equal to Tim when I run this playbook. I'm just going to make sure that this is obvious by changing the task. Here, my name is name. Okay, so I can run this again. I'm just going to clean up my playbook. I don't really need this install Nginx. And I'm going to gather facts no to make my playbook run quicker. Okay, so now you can see that I loaded the file from the example.yaml task. I loaded the tasks from the example.yaml file. And even though I didn't define my variable anywhere else than in the defaults folder of my role, it was loaded automatically when I used the role. So this is really nice because then I can go back to my playbook, and here I can override this variable, not Tim. I put that in caps to make sure that it's very obvious. And now what's going to happen is that the default value in the role will be overridden by the value that I provided here in my play. So you'll see here when I run the playbook, now the variable name has the value not Tim, because it's defined in the play, and this definition has a higher value, a higher precedence than the default value defined in the role. So the default value in the role is overridden by whatever I defined on my play. This is an important concept to understand because the other folder in the role that you can use is vars, and all the variables defined in vars will have a higher precedence than the values defined in the play. So what happens is that if I go in the vars and I change this value to actually Tim, so this is in the vars folder of my role. So now what I have is that I have my vars folder contains actually Tim. My default folder contains Tim, and my playbook contains not Tim. So what is going to happen here when I run my playbook is that the variable value that will be given back to me is actually Tim, because this variable defined in the vars has a higher precedence than what is defined in the play. So this is why you have to be really careful when you define default values for your roles, which is typically what you want to do, unless you want to define a private variable. But for everything that are like parameters, you want to use the defaults folder. If you have a variable that you want to use in your role and just in that role, then you can define it in vars because you are sure that this value is going to be always the same because it has a high precedence, as I said earlier. But usually for default parameters, you want to use the defaults folder. More information about this can be found on the Ansible website, where you have this using variables page, which is very useful. And the variable precedence link here tells you in order from the least important to the highest precedence, how variables work. So here you can see that something that's defined in the role defaults will have a lower precedence than what is defined in the play, but the play will have a lower precedence than what is defined in the role variables. Another thing that is useful with roles is that, as you've seen, there are two folders, files and templates, which allow you to organize your required files in a very nice way. So let's say that you'd like to copy a file somewhere on your remote target. I'm going to add a task for that. Example that YAML sounds good. And here I'm going to load, and I'm going to use copy. And the source is going to be, well, example.txt. And the destination is going to be /tmp/example.txt. This is a very straightforward task. It will copy a file from my local computer to my remote target on the /tmp folder. What's interesting to see here is that we didn't specify a path to that file. It just gave it the name of the file. So if we save this task and we try to run the playbook, we will see that obviously the file does not exist locally, but if you look closely, you will see that by default, because that task is in a role, Ansible is going to look first for a file in the files folder. So we don't have to specify that we want this file in the files folder because we are in a role. Ansible, when we refer to modules that uses files, Ansible will look for them in the files and templates folder. So here I can just echo something into my file, which I think was called example.txt. Run my playbook again. And my file was copied to my remote target. So what is nice here is I didn't specify a path and the file was taken directly from the files folder. I just realized that there is a warning here about using the variable name. And this is something that I should have mentioned. It's just for the demo, but there are a bunch of variables that are reserved and that you shouldn't use. Name is one of them. But basically a lot of variables, especially the one that starts with Ansible _ are reserved and you should not use them. So here I just used it for the demo because I knew it doesn't have any side effect. But this is something you should be careful when defining variables. Right, so that was the stuff about the files. The same behavior can be found with the templates. So if you want to do the same with the templates, template a file to remote, we can do template. Now we can do source example J2 because it's using Jinja for the templating language. J2 is a nice extension for templates, and I'm going to output that into /tmp/template.txt. So I'm now using templates. So obviously, this template file will be looked for in my templates folder in my role. And this template file was called example.j2. And in here, I'm going to use variables. So I can say, hey, now if I run this playbook, the file should already be copied to the remote. So I templated my file out to the remote, and if I SSH to that machine, to have a look at my files, what was it? You'll see that my variable was replaced in my remote target by the variable, and the same rules apply for variables precedence in templates as they do in playbooks. So here we have actually Tim, because we have the vars folder, which has a higher precedence than the playbar. This is something that you'd like to do for the app when you will want to configure the app based on variables. So here I'm going to use a file called backend.conf. And my backend, how did I call it again? I should call it backend.j2. That would be easier to understand. You know that it's a template. Okay, so now backend.j2, video templates, backend.j2. So here I have the original configuration file from repository. And here I'm going to use db host. And here I'm going to use db name. Here db user. And here db password. Because I'm using these variables in my configuration file, I obviously need to define them in my role. So I'm going to define default values for these variables. So db host, db name, db user, and db password. Head db host, localhost, db name, backend, user, example, and db password. Yes, it's secure. So now I have default values for my variables here. My template is using these variables. So I should be able to run my playbook and be happy with the result. Okay, so the file was templated out. Let me just SSH to the machine. address. I'm going to SSH. And here in /tmp, I do have my backend.conf, and you'll see that the values have been updated by whichever values have been set in the default folder for my variables. So now if I come back here and I go to my playbook, and I would like to make this work on a different host, let's say my endpoint aws.amazon.com, db name another, db user team, and db password very insecure. Now if I run my playbook again, because these variables are defined in the play, they will have higher precedence than those defined in the defaults. So these are going to be the variables set when running my task. Sorry. My task has changed. And if you look at your configuration file, now your MySQL host has been updated. So obviously, this is something that you would like to make sure it happens. And then when it happens, you want to reload the service. So in your playbook, it would look something like this in the task file. Nope. So the task file, no, not this one, remains a typical task file from Ansible. So you can do everything you'd like. You can register backend file. And here you can do something like, well, pretend we restart the service. And here we are going to debug. You would need to do systemd here, but it's just for the example. And here we started the service. And here you would use a conditional when backend conf file that change. So this task is only going to run when this task is changed, which will allow us to only restart the service when the values have changed in the configuration file. Now, because everything has already been run, my task is going to be skipped. The values didn't change, but if I change the values in my play with a different username, then the template file will change something on my target. And because that task will change, then my conditional here with when is going to turn to true, and this task is going to be run. So that allows you to restart your service after templating out your configuration. Your variables don't have to be defined as a static variable in your play. It sometimes happens that you are running tasks on your local host. So let's say you would provision an EC2 instance or your RDS cluster on using localhost as the target, and that would give you a variable, and you would like to use this variable in that play. So here I'm going to do that. I'm going to pretend that gather info about EC2 instance, and I'm going to use EC2 instance info. I think this is in community.aws. See that? And probably we need to use filter, filters, state. I need to look at the documentation. Oh, it should be Amazon, AWS. Here it should be Amazon. And there we have filters. Oh, instance state name. All right. Instance state name. And then I think there's probably something with tags. Something like tag role app. Let's say register. What am I doing? EC2 info. Okay. So now I'm going to run this again with -v just to look at the output. Not sure what that actually work. Let's say I want the I can't see anything. Going to debug that variable. Okay, so I want to get my instances list. I'm going to take the first element, and then I'm going to get network private IP address. That's not good. No, it's in instances. It seems. Okay, so let's have a look at that. That instances, we want the first one, and I'm going to get the private IP. No, that's not good. Oh, it's because the way Ansible works with variables. So in Ansible, when you want to access a list element, you can use the square brackets or you can use the dot. It's very flexible with the way you can access your elements. All right, so I got my private IP address. So obviously you would like to get the IP address from your database. This is really just an example, but here I have what I want. EC2 info.instances.0, the private IP addresses. And here, what we would like to do is to make sure that we can use that value here in our template. So the problem is that you cannot define db host as being something, host vars, whatever, etc., etc. And sometimes you want to define variables in a dynamic way. So you can do that with Ansible as well, using the setFact module. So I'm going to define the db host variable here, and I'm going to use setFact. I'm going to go with db host. Well, is this. So now, if I run, well, not with -v, it's going to be variables, and you can remove the debug here as well. Now, if I run this playbook, my host for my database is going to be defined by the IP address of my EC2 instance taken from my other play. So now if I look at my file here, ooh, it didn't work as I wanted because it didn't interpolate my variable. So this should be replaced by, and this is a huge mistake. My bad. Obviously, you want to use host vars here because EC2 info has been defined in a different play. So you use host vars that localhost.ec2 info.instances, and you want to make sure this is an actual variable. My bad. That should work. By the way, we can see that our conditional works pretty well because we changed the host and it restarted the service. And the same is going to happen here. And now we have it. The MySQL host has been automatically defined dynamically based on a variable that was defined in your play and not based on a variable that was defined statically in your variables. So this is very useful, and this is something you'll have to do for the lab in your week 9. Most likely, you will not define the DB host in your variables, but you will use a set fact to dynamically define the host to either your EC2 instance, if the RDS database variable is false, or the EC2 instance, the RDS cluster, if the RDS variable is true. So as you can see here, you can define your variable dynamically inside your tasks. Okay, so now that you know all that, you can work on the lab for next week, probably in a relaxed way. There are 3 roles that you need to create, and most of the tasks you should already have them. So it's mostly about reorganizing your files and tasks into roles. So you'll have to create the application role that provisions the application, the database role, which provisions the database, and AWS role, which is going to be the most complex one, which is going to provision your EC2 instance. And then based on the value of a variable, it will either run an RDS cluster or an EC2 instance to actually run your database. So this is going to be where you'll have to do most of the work with different tasks file based on the actions that you want to perform on your on the database side. There is also a playbook that was given to you, that is given to you on the Lab 9 week page. So you should use that